Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, January 13th. And what we decided to do is that we were going to flip around two dates. Originally, you would have delivered your speech number 2 today, and then we would have talked about persuasive speeches on Friday. But instead, we're going to talk about persuasive speeches today, and then on Friday is when you will be posting your speech number 2. So that gives you a little bit of extra time to prepare for your second speech, and also to contact me if you haven't already done so about what you will be doing for your second speech. As you know, that is an informative speech. It is 10 minutes long, and I'm asking you to use one audio or one visual. And if you look at the notes below, what you will see is that first I have put together all of the feedback that you have submitted in from your peers, or for your peers, I should say, for speech number 1, the autobiographical. So you can see that I've listed strengths and weaknesses, and when there were lots of duplications, I would have just listed that one. So I try to keep it as clean and simple as possible. So you can look below and see the feedback from your peers for your own speech, as well as for the other speeches as well. And hopefully that'll help you in terms of putting together speech number 2, which happens to be your informative speech. And you can see that after the feedback, I've got a list of dates. And I just wanted to keep you aware of where we are in the semester. Believe it or not, we have 1 week left, and one of those days is devoted to a holiday. So as we know, the intersession is indeed intense. So today, Thursday, I will be talking about persuasive speeches. Friday, you will be posting speech number 2, and what I will do is I will have a Moodle folder for you to be able to post that. It'll be in the top section of our Moodle site, and I'm asking you to post that by Friday at noon. And then also I'm asking you to schedule between now and Wednesday of next week your last practice session with me, the connection that you're going to make with me about your speech number 3, which is the persuasive speech. So that moves us to a weekend, which we wouldn't meet, and Monday, which we would normally meet on a Monday, but this upcoming Monday is the 17th, and that's Martin Luther King Day, so there are no classes. So that means that our next class would be on Tuesday, the 18th, and that's when we've got quiz number 3. And I also will perhaps be talking with some of you about your speeches, which you will deliver on the 9th, which is Wednesday. And that's persuasive speech number 3. Again, if you think you want to deliver that speech via Zoom, contact me. And if I can get more than one person interested, we can arrange a time. But thus far, it seems like people have been interested in uploading their speeches, which is perfectly fine. And what I will do with speech 2 after you've uploaded it is very similar to what I did with speech 1, is that I will gather all of your feedback for your peers and then put that together and then be able to present that to you. And then our very last class is on Thursday, the 20th, and that's where we have our final quiz. So that does it for us for the academic semester, believe it or not. And in terms of persuasive speeches, what we've got is the longest of the 3 speeches. This is a 15-minute speech that you will be delivering next week. And I'm asking you to use at least 3 outside sources. And it can be any combination of sources. They can be all online sources or all books if you'd like. You'll remember that I discussed in a previous class, the GCC library, and some of the things to consider when you're using outside resources. You do want to make sure that you're using valid resources more than anything else. And that while the internet provides fast and easy results, it oftentimes provides inaccurate results. So you need to be very cautious. Less cautious if you're working through a library and using something like a database, for instance, because those sources have been evaluated by some individuals, which is why they are fee-based sources and why usually as individual subscribers, we don't have access to them. Instead, they are purchased through organizations much like schools, like GCC. So I'm asking that you list your 3 outside sources on your speaking outline, and that when you submit in your speaking outline to me, that via email, just like you did with your first outline, that at the bottom of that or at the ending of that, you've listed your 3 sources. And as you know, there are lots of different ways that you can indicate sources. MLA is the common way for doing the humanities. But again, as long as you are giving the main pieces of information, you don't necessarily have to put it in an MLA format. But I do want to see what your sources are just so that I can take a quick peek at them. So, for a persuasive speech, you need to select a topic that can be debated. So think about the autobiographical speech, and while there was information given in the autobiographical speech, it was specific information about your life history, your biography. And then for the second speech, you were giving information about a subject outside of yourself. You were trying to teach us about something. The third speech is a persuasive speech where you're trying to convince us of something, whether it be to take a particular action, let's say to donate money or sign a petition, or whether it be to support a particular position or cause, or perhaps a combination of the two. And again, it's something that reasonable people could disagree about. It's a topic that can be debated. So you don't want to give an informative speech where you're just giving facts. The reality is that all of these speeches kind of blur together. So I'm not necessarily surprised if your informative speech has autobiographical elements in it, because you probably are making reference to yourself when you're teaching us something. Much like when you get to your persuasive speech, not only would I not be surprised if it had autobiographical elements, but it will need to have informative elements, because you need to give information in order to be able to persuade us. But you want to move beyond information, and then you want to try to convince us of a particular position. One of the things I always suggest that you try to do is to refute the opposing side, at least briefly, that rather than pretend that there is no other position outside of your own, which I think weakens your position by acting that way. Acknowledge that there are other positions, and if you can briefly talk about why those positions are not as strong as your own position, that just merely strengthens your particular position. And outside sources always enhance credibility, assuming that they're valid outside sources. It's one of the reasons why I'm asking you to use outside sources here. Now, there are lots of different ways that you could go about this persuasive speech. One of the things that you could do is look again at former assignments that you might have done in perhaps English classes or other classes where you needed to support a particular position, and you can adapt that accordingly for the context of this particular class. You can also think about those topics that you just tend to debate about, those dinner table topics. Some of them are hot button topics. I realize that. Some of them are very controversial, things like gun control and abortion and politics and things of that nature. And there's nothing wrong with working with a persuasive speech that is controversial. If this isn't the venue, college, that we can talk about controversial issues in a civil way, then we really do have no hope as a peoples. So I wish that Washington could be as civil as my students have been in the past in terms of trying to persuade their audience of a controversial position. That said, if you don't like controversy, you don't necessarily have to follow controversy either. You can talk about a speech topic that's much less controversial. I've heard many speech topics that really have very little controversy associated with them. For instance, that you should improve your diet. But who's going to argue with that? Or increase exercise. But the reality is that this is the kind of topic that most people agree with, and yet it's very difficult for them to implement. So that's one of the things that you would need to consider if you were addressing a topic of this nature, is that how do you actually encourage people to take action to exercise when, yes, they'll agree they should exercise, they want to exercise, they will exercise, but they don't exercise. So there's a lot of different ways, as I indicated, that you could approach this. You can also look at some of the library databases, and some of the databases deal with or offer you pro and con positions on controversial topics. Opposing viewpoints is one of those databases in the GCC library that might also give you some ideas. Or just sort of reviewing what you discuss on a day-to-day basis, because probably over the course of a day, you probably mention multiple things that you wish were different. Some of them being rather grand, and then some of them probably being very small and minuscule, such as, I wish there was an elevator in this building, or why isn't there a stoplight at this intersection? And again, it's something that reasonable people could disagree about. You might also want to think about the topics that you've discussed in your previous speeches, both autobiographical and informative. So in your autobiographical speech, you might have talked about that you were a sports fan. And for your informative speech, you might have given us the history of football. And for your persuasive speech, you might argue that GCC should start a football team. So you could see how all three of those are related. That said, you don't necessarily have to have all three related at once. They can all be independent speeches as well, if you so decided to. So trying to convince somebody to take a particular action or to support a particular position is no easy task. And in fact, this could be an entire class that we could devote to psychology and sociology. But I did want to talk, at least very briefly, about motivational appeals, ways to go about motivating individuals to take action or to support a position. And this is a very oversimplified way of explaining motivational appeals. Again, we could spend an entire semester discussing this. But basically, there are three primary motivators for an individual. Affiliation, which is belonging. People want to belong to the group. Achievement, which is success, which basically means that people want to have a certain level of success in their lives. And lastly, power. People want to have a certain amount of control in their lives. If you think about television advertisements for products, they will oftentimes utilize one or several of these appeals. The affiliation appeal, that if it's the number one product, everybody is using it, so you should as well. The achievement appeal, that if you happen to be driving a particular car, then that probably means you've achieved a certain level of success, as you can tell from the way the driver is dressed and the kind of home which they pull up to in their car. And also power. And again, car commercials are really great for this, in that ultimately you may not have power at home or at work, but the assumption is that behind the wheel of your automotive, you should be able to have control of speed and climate and so forth. So all of those, as effective as they can be, probably are dwarfed by one other motivational appeal. But you need to be extremely cautious when you're using this kind of motivational appeal, and that's fear. Fear works very well to motivate individuals, and we've seen how the media has done this. However, you need to use cautiously, because fear interferes with reasoning, and we've also seen the consequences of that in our own society. So I guess what you need to do is to think about the pros and cons of using fear, whether the ends justify the means. I could try to use fear to encourage you not to smoke by showing you some images of individuals who have died from smoking. The idea is that I'm trying to scare you, and I might say that this is for the greater good, so it's worthwhile. But we've seen many times how the media has tried to use fear as clickbait. For instance, talking about a terrible weather event occurring, and then we click on and we realize they were talking about something from the past. But we thought it was going to be something from our near future, so we were likely to click on it, which means advertising dollars for the particular website. So be very cautious with fear. Now, there's something called Monroe's motivated sequence. He is a theorist, Monroe, who got credit for talking about something that basically we've been talking about over the course of this semester. How it is that a speech is probably put together and how an audience responds to a speech. That first you need to get the audience's attention. And then you need to present some sort of need if you are giving a persuasive speech. Something needs to change. And then you need to show some level of satisfaction that with your proposal, things will get better, not worse. And try to visualize that as much as possible, because ultimately then that helps the audience get a sense of imagery, which appeals to the senses, which helps with motivation. And finally, if you want an audience to take a particular level of action, that's what you would do. The way you go about it is by presenting an argument. And this doesn't necessarily mean a fight. An argument is a claim. In other words, you're taking a position that reasonable people could disagree with. And you are supporting that claim with evidence. And you are also supporting that claim with some sort of reasoning pattern. Now, there are lots of different kinds of claims. And as you can see in the notes below, something like a claim of fact, which would seem to not be debatable, can be debatable. Something like GCC is a small school. That's a claim of fact. That's true. But by what standard? In comparison to what? GCC might seem like a very large school compared to other schools. Or we could have a claim of value that something is good or bad, and good or bad is oftentimes subjective. So we could say that GCC is a good school. But again, how do you measure such a thing? We talked about quantitative and we talked about qualitative. And quantitative is statistics, numbers, data, for instance, graduation rates. And then qualitative would be things like, student anecdotes. And both of those have a certain level of validity in terms of determining whether or not a school is good or bad. I wouldn't say that one piece of evidence is better than another. They're just different. Or how about a claim of policy, the idea that we should take some sort of course of action or develop a policy. For instance, GCC should reestablish a sports program, because once upon a time we did have a sports program. But because of economics, it was eliminated in the 1990s. It hasn't been reestablished. One could say that GCC has lost money by not having a sports program, because it wasn't able to attract students or recruit students who would be interested in joining a sports program. Or you could say that GCC saved money by not having to finance a sports program. Or perhaps it's a combination of the two. I mean, oftentimes it's very difficult to identify cause and effect. So claims of policy, of course, what you're doing is you're trying to weigh the pros and cons and making a determination that the pros outweigh the cons. But again, that's not always necessarily a clear-cut thing. And in terms of reasoning patterns, you can use inductive reasoning. In other words, through a series of examples, you draw a conclusion. Something like medical studies. If you do enough medical studies, the assumption is that proves the effectiveness of a particular, let's say, pharmaceutical. Though you know there can certainly be errors with that, which is why sometimes pharmaceuticals are recalled. There could be deductive reasoning, which is a generalization that's made from all of those examples. So the generalization that I put in the notes below, which is a true generalization, that college leads to success. But college doesn't always lead to success, and I'm sure we can think of instances where individuals went to college but were not necessarily successful. But generally speaking, which is why you're in college, college leads to a certain improvement in one's life situation. Or reasoning from signs, some sort of observable mark. So for instance, if you're experiencing a sore throat, that could mean that you've got a head cold. It also happens to be one of the symptoms for Omicron, as I was reading recently. Just something to consider. The idea is that if you've experienced this sign frequently enough, you are able to induce through all of those examples that there is a correlation. And then you can deduce and make the generalization that it's likely that you are catching a head cold. Now, you can make all kinds of errors in reasoning. We do all of the time when we are speaking. What you want to do is to be careful to try to avoid errors in reasoning in your own presentation of arguments, and certainly to listen for errors in reasoning in others' arguments and to hold them accountable when they're committing an error in reasoning. So I just wanted to talk about a few possible errors in reasoning. Again, this could be a semester-long course. A hasty generalization when there's too little evidence in order to be able to make some sort of a conclusion. This oftentimes happens, for instance, at the time of the semester where decisions need to be made about opening and closing, specifically closing courses, as we're getting close to the beginning of the semester. And someone might generalize and look at a course and say, well, it's got too few students, and it's had too few students for the past several semesters, therefore that course is not viable. But it may not be the course. There could be other outside factors at play, such as the time the course is being offered or the instructor of the course. It may not be the course itself. So you have to be careful that you've got enough evidence to justify something. When you don't, you're making a hasty generalization. Or appeal to ignorance. In other words, what we don't know. You are putting the responsibility on the audience or on others to prove you wrong rather than you proving yourself right. So for instance, I could say I am a space alien from Mars and basically indicate that until you can prove that I'm not a space alien from Mars, I am a space alien from Mars. So that's the appeal to ignorance. Or how about the bandwagon fallacy, joining the crowd, that everybody else is doing something? I call this the teenager argument, that everybody else is going to the party, so I want to go to the party too, because we all want to belong to the group. But just because everybody is doing this, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the correct action or the correct belief to support. A sequential fallacy, the belief that cause and effect are related, that the cause of something leads to the effect. And that can be the case, or it may not be the case. I mean, I could say that when I was taking the quiz, I had a migraine, and that's why I performed poorly. All right, that's valid. Except I've been performing poorly on quizzes throughout my academic career, whether I've had a migraine or not, which means that the migraine is irrelevant to the performance that I've just tried to draw a correlation with. So again, you've got to be careful with cause and effect and make sure that there aren't other variables at play. And I always say that politicians will always take credit for things going well in the economy, and politicians will always place blame on others when things are going poorly in the economy. Begging the question, which is basically just rephrasing the question. It's circular reasoning. So for instance, you might be asked, what is empathic listening? The answer is not listening with empathy. Basically, you've just rephrased the question. What you want to say is emotionally supportive listening, which was on the first quiz. The appeal to authority sounds like it has a certain level of validity to it because this is an authority that's endorsing something. But this is a celebrity authority, so this person doesn't really have expertise in order to be an authority. We oftentimes see this with celebrity endorsements, individuals like influencers, for instance, or celebrities who are promoting a particular product. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have expertise in that particular product. A sports figure trying to convince you to switch your telephone service. And the sports figure might have expertise in something like sports attire, but I really don't see a connection with something like telephone service. But the assumption is if you value and respect the sports figure, then you're going to try to mimic their behavior. And that means to take their endorsements and their likes and dislikes into account and to try to mimic them. Name calling, and that's exactly how it sounds, is that basically rather than talking about the argument, you are attacking the speaker and you're calling them names. It's what I call the schoolyard argument that kids do on the school ground. And we do know that you're not supposed to do that. But the reality is oftentimes different than what we learn. So if you will look in the notes below, you will see that I have included an article from diverseeducation.com talking about a situation that did descend into name calling. And I want to give you the context for this. And basically, it was a debate club, two debate clubs from two universities, and they were competing against one another. It's somewhat similar to speech, the distinction being that in a debate, what you've got is a group of individuals presenting a position, and then another group of individuals trying to refute that position and defend their own. And usually there's a series of judges in order to be able to make a determination for the winner of that particular debate. And in this particular instance, we've got two universities competing against one another. And the two debate coaches knew each other previously, and they had a very, shall we say, challenged relationship. So there was already some bad blood between them. And the debate went very badly. And you're probably thinking, well, that the debate members, the students, descended into name calling. Unfortunately, no. It was the debate coaches who should have known better, because we're talking about PhDs in communications and rhetoric and speech, descended into name calling. And it got very, very heated. So much so that when one of the students recorded the event, and the event was not supposed to be recorded, perhaps that's the reason why the individuals involved acted the way they did. But when the event was recorded and put online, it then went viral and hit all the academic newspapers. It resulted in the termination of one of the debate coaches. The debate coach that was terminated was the debate coach who basically mooned the other debate coach. He lowered his pants, but he was still wearing underwear, so you can debate whether or not that's a true hazing, or a true mooning, I should say. And then the other debate coach was put on probation. To complicate matters, the debate was about a very sensitive topic about race relations. And one debate coach, the one who was put on probation, a female, black, and the other debate coach, the one who had engaged in the supposed or alleged mooning, white and male. So there are all kinds of dynamics going on here. And I mentioned this to you not to point out who's wrong, who's right. I mean, that's not really that interesting to me. What's interesting to me is that you've got two seasoned professionals in their field engaging in very unprofessional behavior and descending into name calling and also alleged moonings. Now, I don't have the video in its entirety. Both of these debate coaches have tried their hardest to get it wiped clean from the internet and have been unable to do so. Let that be a lesson to you about electronic footprints, that once you put something on the internet, it is very, very difficult to remove. But I do have a clip of this for you to be able to see briefly the profanity that was exchanged between them. So I use this as an example of what not to do, and how easy it is to lose control of one's intellectual abilities in the face of emotion. So you need to be very careful to keep your emotion in check when you're talking about persuasive issues. So I ask you to watch that particular video. And for the attendance question, again, since we flipped things a little bit, things are going to be a little bit odd. You're not going to have an attendance question that will be due on Friday morning. On Friday morning, or tomorrow morning, if you're watching this on Thursday, you will be uploading your speech. But what I do ask is that by Tuesday morning, keep in mind that Monday is a holiday. That's why I'm saying on Tuesday. But this gives you several days. I'd like you to send one strength and one weakness of your classmate's speech number 2, which you're going to be uploading on Friday, to my email at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. So basically, I'm going to be asking you to do what you did with speech 1. Once everybody has uploaded their speech for speech 2, a Friday at noon, you've got up until Tuesday morning to watch all of your classmates' speeches, identify a strength and weakness, send that to my email, and then I can post that onto our class on Tuesday when we reconvene. So I hope you're all doing well. I am doing well, and we will continue on with public speaking. Take care. Bye-bye.